is his biggest problem with the moon landing. I'm with you there. It's a big problem for me as well. Our final category in part one tonight. Part one is the moon landing never happened. It was a hoax. It's one of my favorite categories. Stanley Kubrick. So it just so happened, CJ and Smitty and listeners, that the year before Apollo 11, 1968, a movie came out, a movie that we've talked about on this show. CJ and Smitty, you may not remember this, but we actually did an entire episode on this movie. CJ proved she knew very little trivia whatsoever about this movie. Do you remember that, CJ?
Odyssey.
Do you remember that? And not only that, but this movie has played a role in our show many times since then. Talk about synchronicity with the appearance of the rectangular anomalies all over the planet, right? Remember those?
Yep.
What are they called again? Why am I blanking on what the rectangular anomalies? The monoliths, right? The monoliths. Well, it just so happened 1968, an entire year before Apollo 11, that a special movie came out with groundbreaking special effects to simulate space travel and depict scenes in outer space, including on the moon. That movie we're talking about, of course, is 2001, A Space Odyssey, directed by none other than Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick, get this, actually hired high-level engineers from NASA to consult on the film. Did Kubrick know folks with NASA? Absolutely. They consulted 2001, A Space Odyssey. Did the moon landing photo video come from Hollywood? You know, Kubrick certainly had the technology to make us think that it did. Were the astronauts really in lower Earth orbit? Some people think that we just sent our astronauts into lower Earth orbit while Kubrick filmed some of these scenes in Hollywood. Could the NASA video, back to tech here, have been pre-recorded? Guess what? The television networks would not have known if this NASA feed was actually pre-recorded or not. The grainy footage of Neil Armstrong was clunky, grainy. Again, we said NASA said this low-tech video is on purpose to avoid tech issues. They lost the original tape, so again, we don't know if it was pre-recorded or not. One of my favorite things about this Stanley Kubrick thing, and this is what I found out in my research, it even goes past 2001: A Space Odyssey. Raise your hand if you've seen The Shining. Smitty, you've seen The Shining, right?
This is not
I
raising
can't get
my
my hand into the screen. There we go. Yeah.
So, some people say Stanley Kubrick was very well aware of the theories with him and the Apollo 11 mission and the Apollo program. Check out this picture. I bet you wonder if you remember this, of Danny, the creepy boy, Red Rum from The Shining. Check out his sweater.
Danny Torrance.
Yep, check out his sweater.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. That reaction.
What year was that filmed?
The Shining was in 70 something after the Apollo program.
Yeah.
What was the little boy's name?
Danny
Torrance.
And for our folks that can't see, Danny Torrance in The Shining literally wore an Apollo 11
Oh my gosh, that's
sweater.
so crazy.
An Apollo 11 sweater. You know, Stanley Kubrick may not have helped fake the moon landing in Hollywood, but he certainly didn't mind messing with people's heads in The Shining. And some people actually say that Jack Nicholson's, his character in The Shining, his descent into madness represented Stanley Kubrick's own guilt over the Apollo program. Now, I do want to address this real quick. Some people say and Smitty brought this up. He said 100,000 people worked on the Apollo program. Actually, the estimates are more like 400,000 were involved in the Apollo program. However, unlike every NASA program since, which has been highly open to the press, these Apollo programs were extremely compartmentalized. The press was never given direct access to the astronauts or exactly what was happening. Very interesting, right? As a matter of fact, people estimate that perhaps less than 100 people were actually in the inner circle of what was actually happening with the Apollo program. So could Stanley Kubrick have faked this in Hollywood in front of 400,000 people? No. But given how compartmentalized it was, well, what do you think, Smitty? Stanley Kubrick helped fake the moon landing.
It's possible, but I don't see how they would have. I guess they could have faked it with. I don't know. I just don't think it's faked personally. But Kubrick, if anybody could have done it, he could have had because he was a super great director. Of course, he also filmed Clockwork Orange, so that made him pretty messed up in the head. But one of the most horrifying
Messed up
movies ever
enough
seen.
to fake the moon landing,
I don't
Smitty?
know.
Well, how many aliens you giving
Well,
Stanley Kubrick?
I'm going to give him 2.
I think Smitty just doesn't want the moon landing to be a hoax because he's a history
Yeah.
expert.
Yeah.
Well, maybe so.
Well,
It's possible.
whoever has the power writes the history, right?
That's right. Well, over to you, CJ. Stanley Kubrick helped fake the moon landing.
Okay. Yeah. So I didn't want to believe it, but as a child, you hear those words, right? That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, and it just sounds so powerful and beautiful, and like bringing countries and worlds together and uniting humankind. And then if you listen to it with the idea that it was a hoax, it sounds very scripted and dramatic and like something that only, I don't know, a movie director could come up with. And I do think that it would be a lot easier to fake the moon landing in terms of creating a movie of it or a show of it than it would be to actually get a man to the moon. And then throw in all of the other astronauts, that were involved in the mission that were killed dramatically before it happened, and going back to the compartmentalized, only so many people knew about it. I think like 8 or 10 astronauts died of really tragic things like catching on fire and car accidents and things like that before Apollo 11. So yeah, I think it's really very possible that Stanley Kubrick could have created it. I think that is possible. I don't know if that happened, but I certainly think it could happen. So I'm giving this one a 9.
Wow. 9 aliens from CJ. I'm going to tell you something. Danny Torrance approves. Red rum. No red rum for CJ. Danny Torrance in his super creepy Apollo 11 sweater from The Shining approves. Listener George Winter says the biggest problem he has with the moon landing being fake is the number of people that would have been in on the lie. Someone would have told. That, of course, is an argument. But like we said, it was so compartmentalized. They say perhaps less than 100 people actually really
think
knew
that some
what
people
was going
were
on.
about to tell and lost their lives because of it. There were 3 astronauts, and I should have written down their names, but they were supposed to be the ones to go to space. And one guy came out and said, this mission is a disaster. Somebody is going to die. Somebody is going to lose their lives. And just weeks later, he and 2 other astronauts were killed in a fire in a simulation.
I tell you one
So
thing, that'll keep your
that'll
mouth
keep your mouth shut. Another astronaut and his wife were killed.
Yeah, that right there. Well, I tell you, Stanley Kubrick, I love this conspiracy theory, and here's what I know. he certainly had the technology to put on television a very convincing moon landing. He was connected with people high up in NASA. NASA literally helped him make 2001: A Space Odyssey. Later on, Stanley Kubrick threw it all back in our faces in The Shining. So I am also giving this 9 aliens. Stanley Kubrick, I think he quite possibly was in on it. Absolutely. And so that concludes part 1. The moon landing was a hoax. We'll go back to final thoughts at the very end, Smitty. But now on to part 2 tonight. The flip side of the coin,